Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us. This is going to be Apple School Manager and Azure Federation, one school district story. This is Brian Martin. He's an Apple Systems admin at Lafayette School Corporation. Thanks for joining us, Brian.
All righty. Well, thank you. Thank you for having me. And she introduced me, so I probably don't need to spell that out again. We've got 8,300 plus iPads and 400 plus Macs and under management. And I don't know about you guys, but I don't like taking notes in sessions necessarily. I like going back to the videos later. So there's a QR code that'll download this slide deck for what it's worth. And as been a tradition at JNUCs in the past, a lot of the speakers like to show how long they've been doing Apple stuff since or where they got their start. Here's where I got my start. K through 12 school district in Indiana, working in an Apple II, or doing my assignment there in an Apple II lab. And on my way to the airport yesterday to catch my plane, I was kind of hoping for a little bit of luck from God in doing my presentation. It's a little nerve-wracking, but I saw that and thought it was a good omen. Figured I'd show y'all. Bad joke, it's a local insurance company in my hometown that sells insurance to truckers. They have a new bad joke they put there every week. I saw that one, I'm like, I'm going to have a good presentation. So, moving forward, the topic today is Apple School Manager and Azure integration. I wouldn't have 5 years ago, I wouldn't have thought that would even be possible, like letting Microsoft manage authentication for Apple IDs. That was kind of Apple's domain up until literally March of this year. So in the session, I'm going to talk about defining what federated authentication is, why you'd want to do it, how to do it. I mean, what's scary about the whole thing is the clicks to actually initiate federation are easy. It's the planning that goes into it that makes it a difficult task. And take some Q&A at the end. So to define it, first of all, I don't know if anybody ever took certification classes lots of years ago or even recently. They always stress the concept of what is authentication versus what is authorization. So in federated authentication, basically I'm just handing off to Microsoft and Azure the ability to verify the credentials and issue a token for those users to have access to the Apple School Manager system. Also, you still control whether a user has a teacher level role or a student level role or whatnot within School Manager. I'm just handing off the mechanics of verifying the username or the Apple ID and password to Microsoft. That's the difference between that. And here's Microsoft's model if you're trying to federate a service. I looked at this very extensively when trying to understand how it all works for me. There's the document on that. Like I said, basically we're just handing off the verification of the creds to a third party. Authorizing it, you still use Apple School Manager to determine who gets what role and what they're allowed to do. So why do you want to federate? Well, as evidenced by my no new logins little checkbox there, that's the main reason. I don't need to hand my kids that are in, say, first grade or kindergarten another set of credentials and another set of passwords. Arguably, we shouldn't be having to hand credentials to students of that age, period, let alone another new set. So, well, apparently my audio and slide deck went out. Okay. Oh, that one's still there. Okay. The account creds are all created in one single place. So if you've got AD and you've got it federated with Azure, the same person that administers our AD creds makes sure that they have the proper rights in Office 365 and Azure to do that. So, okay, what's great about that, the kids only have to memorize one set of creds, and if they need a password change for whatever reason, same way as we'd change their AD password. That's one reason why I'd do it. Another one, I don't know if anybody, is anyone here already using School Manager for a lot of this? Okay. So you'll know that if you try to use School Manager for things like schoolwork and whatnot, and your end users have that, if I recall correctly, teacher users are required to use two-factor authentication for that. And you run into the task of a teacher saying maybe, hey, why am I having to use my personal cell phone to verify my authentication? And that's kind of a bit of a problem. Well, when you do federated authentication, that goes away. So let's see there we go. Okay. So I actually want to take us back a little bit. Does anyone here remember the Apple ID for Students program? Click consent by parents. Not always the most timely thing that happens. It didn't get done really well, and even Apple pulled it after a couple of years of doing it. Once they did that, I got to the point where I was thinking, can I do iPads without Apple IDs, period? And for a long time, the answer was yes. It's very possible. You know, I can scope apps with device-based app assignments. I can do self-service deployment of apps. I can make sure they've got email profiles. I can make sure they've got everything they need. But, you know, you can do it, but what are you actually missing if you try to do that? Well, recently, Apple and School Manager has said, okay, I've got, for every account that gets created in schools, you get 200 gigs of free iCloud storage. You get Apple Schoolwork. You get Apple Classroom. You get all kinds of benefits. But, oh yeah, after the failure of Apple ID for Students, I didn't want anything to do with Apple IDs. We didn't want to have to reset passwords anymore. We didn't want to have to deal with click consents, whatnot. So I just kept going for a lot of years thinking, you know, we're doing pretty well, but as more and more features rolled out that started needing access to an Apple ID, Classroom really doesn't need access to it, but it makes it a lot easier if they have it. Apple Schoolwork, definitely you need it, because when you're sharing files to your kids and whatnot, you're actually populating their iCloud drives with handouts and whatnot. So those became the missing pieces, and again, for years I coasted on just being able to deploy without them. Then all of a sudden this article crossed my desk one day, 9 to 5 Mac. I try to do the rounds of Apple news sites and whatnot, and this article crossed my, kind of scary. I'm like, wow, this just rolled out, and I'm getting ready to deploy roughly 200 or 300 new staff iPads this summer, and that's the bulk of our staff, not quite all of them, but the bulk of them. Could we manage to make it so the kids aren't having to memorize a new set of creds? Could we pull it off? And I don't know about you guys, but in schools, I don't typically like being on the bleeding edge necessarily of technology. I'm that guy that may wait 6 months before we let a new OS out of the bag or implement a new feature. That way I can see what other people who are a lot bigger fish than I have come up to wrangle this. But I realized our staff is getting new iPads. I may not see a lot of those iPads for a whole lot of time. I'm putting them through change to get their new iPad anyway. This is it. I've got to pull this off. Brand new. Yay. So I started researching it, and I realized those staff iPads and the students get theirs wiped every year, and we re-enroll them. it had to be then, but that kind of left me a narrow window because that article came across my desk in March when it first released, and we needed to get iPads out May 1st. Kind of a scary proposition. So in my research, I found the general Apple steps that they put on their articles. I'm going to provide links to the articles a little bit later. The first off, you got to decide which domain you're going to federate. So you probably have gathered that we chose to federate our root domain, which literally is where everybody had been for years creating their personal Apple IDs and whatnot. I actually, when I started researching this, was of the opinion, no, let's not federate our root domain. Let's choose another domain. That way I don't have to deal with kicking everybody off their Apple ID or all the various things I'm going to talk about here that are ramifications of it. So then we're going to connect it to Azure one time to verify that we control the domain. One of the mechanics of it require you to do that. And then, so the view Apple ID conflicts on your domain, that one's kind of a scary one. Apple does not provide you a list of everybody who's ever had an Apple ID on your domain. They provide you a number. Gets kind of tricky. I've got a strategy there that we use to work around that. Then you've got the grunt work of, so once you know the conflicts, how are you going to get them resolved? Are you going to make everybody go get a Gmail account and move their personal Apple IDs to that? Are you going to give them another domain to put them on? I mean, you have to have a strategy in place to resolve those. And then finally, once you do have a strategy, you've pulled the trigger, you said you're going to do it, you've got to notify the end users they have a conflict and help them deal with it. We did that as part of distribution of their new iPads. I actually, with a team of my colleagues who I wouldn't have been able to do this project without, we went out to the buildings 2 or 3 weeks in a row, 2 or 3 nights a week, and we're like, here's your new iPads, let's help you get them enrolled. For anybody who had trouble following the emails, doing this, let's help you get your Apple ID changed. Couple of feverish chat support sessions with Apple ID support when people forgot their passwords and whatnot. And then when you're finally done, you turn it on and test it. So, okay. As I said before, deciding which domain to federate, we realized we could do any domain. It could be one we controlled. We could do some sort of a branding effort maybe, but ultimately, so long as you can add it to your Azure console, you can choose any, and you control the domain, you can choose to federate any domain with Apple. Ones I looked at was like an apple.lsc or an lsc.k12, or like I said, I had thought maybe of doing a branding campaign one, but didn't really think about that. We wanted to make it work on the root. I was actually challenged by some of our other engineers to make it work on the root. So mainly their rationale to challenge me on that, they wanted a single securely managed set of user creds for the student-facing services. We don't want those first and second graders having to memorize a second set of creds. So we did choose the root domain. To do the mechanics of connecting it to Azure, it's really simple. You just open up your school manager instance, you go to settings, you go to accounts, and you begin the process of declaring the domain that you want to federate. So, okay, the mechanics of it, we're getting to the point of no return. We haven't turned it on yet or anything, but Apple says, hey, we can use this domain. Hey, we can do this. Now we got to start thinking about our conflicts. I've talked about Apple ID for students here. That one's an interesting conflict type to bring up because all of those accounts we created back in the day, yeah, those are all still hanging out somewhere. All of those, anybody who's managed iPads since 2010, 2011, any old Apple ID schemes you used for configurator and whatnot, yeah, those are all still hanging out somewhere in Apple land. But there's more. So I want to go ahead and make a point to define what a conflict is. A conflict is any, with a capital A and Y, personal or hand-created Apple ID that already exists. And any does truly mean any. We're going to get to that in a bit. So by default, Apple, they don't provide you a list. They provide you a number. So you see our total list of accounts there, and then the conflicts. We had, when we got to that point in the process, we realized we had 3,464 conflicts. That kind of scared the crap out of me, and I'm like, where are all these coming from? I know that we only have about little less than 600 or 700 staff members, and maybe you assume the whole student body had them at one point with Apple ID for students, but we started thinking about it and we're like, yeah, we had Apple ID for students. We had old schemes where we created Apple IDs for things. And like I said, it only provides a number. I'm kind of bad as a presenter here. I apologize for that. But so I started drilling down. The any truly does mean any bit. The ones I found that I could come up with were all the staff where we had them created, some old student IDs from Apple ID for students. Our secretary purchases finished goods for us regularly. She had an Apple ID for that. Our any technicians that work in GSX, yeah, those have Apple IDs. You have a developer account, oh yeah. Configurator, and the more scary one, even your APNS cert somewhere had an Apple ID on your domain, most likely. So, yeah, that gets kind of scary. You're thinking maybe some of those cannot be changed. I really wanted to see what the list of conflicts were. I wasn't quite happy with just a number, and neither were our admins on our team. How are we going to know who to help if we don't have a list of what we're up against? But we figured out a way how to do that. What we decided to do was to get in front of this. We told the users this was coming long before that first email went out. We told them it was coming. Here's what it's going to bring you going through this. Here's what Apple's going to ask you to do. When you see an email at that point, here's what you need to do. And we made it a big PR campaign getting out to the users, hey, this is coming. This is going to happen. Once we did that, that freed us to use a trick method to figure out who those Apple IDs were. The trick method was the Exchange server. So what we did when the very first email from Apple went out to any of us on the team we were watching for one of those when we turned the Federation on to start the 60-day process, we can go on the Exchange server and have it capture that particular message and see who else got it. And we got a list of not only those that were active people, but all the people at Bounce that had left the school district or accounts that were long deleted. We were able then to have that list that I so desperately wanted and start Xing out don't cares, don't need to deal with. These are the people we need to help. These are the important accounts we need to figure out. It was just literally having our Exchange admins captured on the server. That is not the best way of doing it. I would have preferred to know before I clicked the button, but if I'm not going to get that from Apple, then I can at least use the mail server to help me. So the only thing I can stress about the communication effort we did ahead of time was I didn't want to get 100 work tickets saying, why did I get this email from Apple? So I had our curriculum integrators and our people that have close tabs with the users that are a lot closer to the users than I am, explain to them, hey, we're going to go through this process to get yourself moved to another Apple ID so we can free up our domain for good things like schoolwork, like Apple Classroom, like having 200 gigs of storage on each one, having backups on the iPads for the first time since Apple ID for students. We outlined all of that. And most importantly, we explained to the users, okay, if you don't know what to do here, that's fine. We're going to be in each of these buildings on these dates. Please show up. Let's get your new iPad. Let's give you the personal touch that school district IT spends a lot of time doing and help them. And that ended up making it so that it was anticlimactic when the Apple email went out. So, pictured here, I do actually have, I blotted out the names and whatnot, but that's the email you get sent from Apple. It's almost kind of looks a little scary. It almost looks like a spam thing where you click on a link and maybe give out your creds. Turns out, no, you don't. But this is what the users got. We were able to search for all that criteria and whatnot. And the Learn More link in the email, there's where it actually points to. It points to an Apple link explaining what's going on. Our general strategy that we ended up using for the users was we took our staff that actively had Apple IDs and whatnot. We worked with them to get a Gmail, a Yahoo, a Hotmail, their husband's account in some case, their wife's account in some case. We helped them find a home for their stuff on a case-by-case basis if they hadn't done so already. A lot of them, I would say a high percentage of our users did this themselves. It was the ones that had password problems or Apple ID changes or that couldn't get in for whatever reason that we saw at the help nights, so to speak. So, end users and Apple ID conflicts. Once you do kick the process off and you've got those emails, that you actually start off a chain reaction of 60 days. In 30 days, Apple's going to nudge you in the right direction to make changes to your Apple ID by cutting off FaceTime and iMessage. And you're going to continue to get prompts on your iPad saying you need to update your Apple ID. You're going to need to do something here. Well, at 30 days, they do that, but at 60 days, they're going to resolve the conflict for you. They're actually going to kick any Apple IDs that you've chosen on a federated domain off and move them to a temporary one that takes the form of something like that. That's per the article I showed earlier. So, back to that, actually. I'm going to go back to that slide. Great. Let's go back to that. So that actually was liberating in the case of a lot of users that we were having problems with. Some of them really didn't care about what they had purchased on that because they didn't have a credit card attached to it. They're like, why don't we just abandon it? At 60 days, that is a strategy you could use. If you've got an Apple ID you just really are not worried about at all, you let the clock run out 60 days, and congratulations, their federated Apple ID then becomes available to be used. Between that, Gmail accounts, Hotmail accounts, random other situations, I'm going to cover one example where those type of accounts are not going to be used. Those are going to be your mission-critical accounts. So, like I said, we had the push notification cert, we had GSX accounts, we had Apple developer accounts. All those, I didn't want to put those on a Gmail. Those are our assets. We actually had some old Apple configurator accounts that had one copy of every app we owned. I don't want to lose those. I may need them someday for something, I don't know, but I'm not just going to go hide them on a Gmail account and forget about them. So what we used for that was, I don't know if, okay. We happen to have a second domain that we were going to use as part of a publicity campaign a long time ago. Not for iPads or anything, but our district was going to use it, and then for whatever reason we opted not to use it in a publicly facing way. We were using it to relay like server outage messages and whatnot. I thought about that and I'm like, maybe that's the place to put these 30 or so accounts that we really care about. We can put it on that. We control that domain. It's safe there. I can get the email on that by having it forwarded to our Exchange box. So, yeah, I don't want to put a mission-critical app on, or Apple ID on a Gmail account. So, yeah, I just used a second domain that I didn't declare to Apple is going to be federated. That's where I put things like your MDM push certificate, like your Apple developer accounts, and those sort of things. So, you've went through all those steps. You've actually resolved that. You've worked with your end users. It's a lot of labor to do it, but when it all works, it's going to look something like this. It's actually going to come up with that branding window saying it's on your school district, and it's going to kick you to a Microsoft Oath 365 auth page. You're going to sign in. You're handing off the authentication, like I said earlier, to Microsoft, and now I'm in with whatever level of rights that user had within School Manager. Very basic, but you wouldn't have thought that would ever exist because, you know, Apple's not going to turn over management of their Apple IDs to Microsoft, but sure worked out great for us because we had already done it with PowerSchool. And, well, I don't know if we did it with PowerSchool, but we've done it for a lot of our other single sign-on services. When I saw it, I'm like, we need to do this. But the challenge was big. We needed to do it by May 1st. I wanted the iPads in teachers' hands before they went home for the summer. So we kind of had to move up the thinking about that, the getting the emails out. That had to kind of be a little rushed, but it was well worth it because we got most of those ironed out before people went home, and then the ones that we needed 60 days on to run out the clock, those we did have to deal with in the summer in some cases, but we got the bulk majority out just in that little bit of time before they went home. So I'm definitely not going to be the guy to cover populating School Manager. I don't know. How many here use SFTP versus SIS? Okay. So we're using SIS with PowerSchool to populate it, and that has been kind of a journey in and of itself. We ran into some troubles with the PSM _student email field within it, but we got those worked out. I'm definitely not the one to speak on that. I would defer to the guys at Apple that are doing that. I think Apple is leading a session. Yeah, they're leading a session tomorrow on that. Okay, so I highly recommend that. Now, as a result of you've simplified your life, you've went and integrated it with Azure, well, you know, you have to declare that to Jamf somehow to get all those in and get managed classes and whatnot. When you set up Jamf with that, you have to figure out a duplicate matching routine. And that's almost an art. I had somebody at Jamf when we were trying to set it up one time before saying, first name starts with this or email address starts with, trying to find it, and we still ended up with duplicates. Well, with us being able to federate and do it on the LSC root domain, it was as simple as managed Apple ID equals email address in Jamf Pro. Guaranteed every time. I will say if you're dealing with, say you already had lots of accounts in School Manager and you were using it to its fullest before under a subdomain or whatever, and you choose to do it on your root, it's possible you may have had smart groups formulated that based on email. I don't know how many people would have that, but I would probably give some thought before you change up how you're doing that. I've got a handful of links here that is really kind of consisted of the only documentation Apple had at the time. They're now doing seminars and whatnot in our state anyway, telling people how to do it, but between these links from Apple and talking with our Apple rep, who I got to say, Eric Wheatley has been the most helpful Apple rep there was, dealing with all my questions on this as we went. I wouldn't have been able to do it without him and a good Azure team as well. Microsoft has some helpful articles on that. Any kind of help with getting Office 365 populated. And I don't have a conclusion slide really. I'm kind of going to go to Q&A, but I'll say one other thing. The two biggest things you're going to run into when choosing to do this is deciding what domain you're going to federate and deciding how you're going to resolve whatever your list of conflicts are going to be. Your list may be none. You choose to do a subdomain. If you choose to do your root, you may be like me, resolving 3,000 in some form. And with that, I'll cut over to Q&A. Yes?
On your APN change, did you have to...
APNS server? Yeah.
Did you have to re-enroll all your devices?
No, I did not. So that one was one I did ahead of time, actually. I got pretty smart on that. I simply went to appleid.apple.com like I would with any personal Apple ID that, hey, I changed from Gmail to Hotmail today, but I still want to keep all the things I bought from Apple over the years. I just simply changed the email address, and it really didn't affect anything. I was scared to death on what you're talking about. I was scared to death that was going to happen. Our Apple rep kept reassuring me, no, that's what you should be. Your Apple ID is just a series of like GUID or SID or random numbers. Actually, you're just using a friendly label. So when you change the friendly label, that doesn't affect that your push cert was generated off the number and whatnot. So absolutely, I can say without a doubt, no, we did not have to re-enroll a single device off this. We had to enroll our new ones for the project, but we did not have to re-enroll anybody. You do not. I can say that without a doubt. If we had, I would have immediately, it would have been a subdomain right there. That was rule number one. I was not re-enrolling anything.
Change it to a non-domain email address?
What we did, the push notification cert, remember I had a slide a couple of slides back about using a second domain? We used lscinfo.us. I didn't put it on there. That was the brand. They had a branding campaign.
But if you didn't have a second domain...
You really need to probably invest in one. I'm not saying that has to be how you do it, because you could literally put it on a Gmail account or a Hotmail, but I don't necessarily know if that's the wisest answer. Registering a domain is pretty, I'm not going to say cheap, I'm going to say inexpensive. You could put it somewhere, just find a way to make sure you can get email on that domain. Like for instance, when the B. Martin at LSC Info account went in, I needed to make sure that B. Martin at LSC Info, the mail on that was forwarded to my real Exchange box, because I'm not going to check the spam remailer. I mean, that's what we ended up doing, is we had that second domain already, so it didn't cost us anything additional. But if you don't have, it's probably a wise idea to have one. Now, Apple is currently continuing to develop this. In fact, as of like a week and a half ago, they released this to Apple Business Manager side of the house. I got a feeling there's a lot more folks like me. I mean, we were bleeding edge doing this. There's going to be a lot more folks that are going to be scared to death of that push cert. They're going to be scared to death. Am I still going to be able to repair my machines on time in GSX? Can I still get to Apple developer certificates for signing my apps? Am I still going to be able to purchase new products? But I can safely say that no, this did not affect us. In fact, my installer certs still continue to work to this day. My push cert, I did not experience any negative behavior on that. We did not lose any communication with our devices, but the technique I chose was to use a second domain.
If
Yes,
we could
please.
have anybody else asking questions come up to the microphones, just so that they can get recorded for later viewing.
Hello.
Yes.
Noticed when I did the same thing that the student accounts as well as the teacher accounts do not have access to download apps with the App Store.
Okay,
'Cause
so
they get the 200. Sorry, they get the 200 gigs of storage space, but they don't get to be able to access the App Store.
let me ask you this about your environment. Do you have an App Store profile restricting that, App Store configuration restriction?
Yes, yes and no. The teacher ones, I don't have it set to take away the App Store, but for the students, I do.
Okay.
But I noticed when I have a teacher log in with their account, their App Store is not there, so they end up using their own personal.
Okay,
Yes.
he brings up a valid point on that. So ironically, Apple did this. They do not allow commerce on a managed Apple ID, period. They do not allow any form of commerce. So what we had to do in our case was we'd have the teachers sign into iCloud originally, which would populate that managed Apple ID for all services on the device. And then we'd have them go to iTunes and App Store. And for those that moved their Apple IDs to that Gmail or Hotmail, we do that. Apple specifically does not allow commerce, but I thought about that myself. I'm like, that's probably a good thing they didn't, because, okay, say you have a terminated employee that actually attach their own credit card to their Apple ID and whatnot, and we removed their account from the system. Well, all of their investments going to go away. That's going to be somebody complaining and a lawsuit waiting to happen. So I'm kind of glad that they do not allow commerce on that. Let them do commerce and whatnot. Like if a teacher wants to evaluate a paid app and test it out, they can do that. They can probably apply to get it reimbursed. I'd have to check with our district's reimbursement policy on that. But they can try it out, and then if they want it for, say, their student fleet, they're going to file an app request or a work ticket on it. Okay. Well, I'm hoping I answered anyone's questions on it. Like I said, probably the one thing that I can reassure you the most on is that push certificate. That's what scared me the most. When you change the Apple ID on that, that will not affect your communication with Jamf and the devices in any way. Especially like ours, we were due to have to renew that in 2 months. I'm like, well, this will be our test. Sure enough, I renewed it. You'd never know I did this. You'd never know it wasn't always on lscinfo.us.
All right. Thank you so much, Brian. Let's have a round of applause.